She had exactly 43 cents in her checking account and 40 acres of sinking, mosquito-infested mud to her name. The locals called it a financial suicide mission, but hidden beneath that toxic-looking sludge was a biological gold mine. Here is how a desperate woman turned a laughingstock swamp into a 7-figure agricultural empire. Harper Montgomery sat in the cramped, overly air-conditioned office of Harrison Trent, the wealthiest landowner in Beauregard County. The leather chair squeaked beneath her as she stared at the lease agreement pushed across the mahogany desk. Trent, a man whose smile never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes, tapped a gold pen against the paper. "You understand the terms, Miss Montgomery?" Trent asked, his voice dripping with condescension. 40 acres of the lower basin, it's unimproved land, no drainage, no infrastructure, and absolutely no refunds on the deposit. You miss a payment by 3 days and the lease is terminated. The land reverts to me, along with anything you foolishly decided to build on it. Harper swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry. She knew exactly what the lower basin was, a notorious stretch of wetland known locally as the Devil's Spittoon. For decades, it had sat dormant, a tangled nightmare of cypress knees, stagnant water, and suffocating algae. Traditional farmers wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. But traditional farmers had capital. Harper had a recently maxed-out credit card, a rusted 1998 Ford Ranger, and the sheer, blinding desperation of a woman who had lost her corporate job, her savings, and her dignity in the span of 6 months. "I understand the terms," Harper said, keeping her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. She uncapped her cheap plastic pen and signed her name on the dotted line. Trent smirked, pulling the paper back. He had made a career out of leasing unusable land to naive city dreamers pocketing their non-refundable deposits when they inevitably went bankrupt, trying to drain the undrainable. "Welcome to farming, sweetheart. Try not to let the mosquitoes carry you away." When Harper arrived at her new property the following morning, the reality of her decision hit her like a physical blow. The air was thick, smelling strongly of sulfur and rotting vegetation. The access road Trent had promised was little more than a muddy trail that ended abruptly in a wall of dense reeds. As she stepped out of her truck, her boot immediately sank 4 inches into the black, sucking muck. Her boyfriend Gregory, who had begrudgingly driven out with her, refused to get out of the passenger seat. He rolled down the window just enough to be heard over the hum of the engine. "Harper, look at this place," Gregory said, his face contorted in disgust. "You can't grow corn here. You can't grow soybeans. You can't even stand up without sinking. You've lost your mind." "I told you I'm not growing corn," Harper shot back, pulling a heavy pair of waders from the truck bed. "The soil tests I did last week showed incredible organic matter. It's a nutrient sink. If I can just establish a drainage perimeter." "With what money?" Gregory interrupted, his voice rising in anger. "You emptied our joint account for the deposit. We have nothing left. I'm not spending the rest of my life waist-deep in a swamp chasing your delusions." Before Harper could formulate a response, Gregory slid over to the driver's seat. "I'm going back to the city," he said coldly. "Call me when you wake up from this nightmare." Harper watched in stunned silence as the Ford Ranger threw up a spray of mud and gravel, disappearing down the trail. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the buzzing of insects and the distant croak of bullfrogs. She was entirely alone. She had no vehicle, no heavy machinery, and exactly 43 cents to her name. For the first few weeks, the swamp seemed intent on breaking her. Harper set up a cheap nylon tent on the only patch of relatively dry ground, a small rise near the property line. She spent her days covered in mud, desperately trying to dig a rudimentary drainage trench by hand, using nothing but a shovel. It was agonizing, back-breaking labor. Every time she carved out a foot of earth, The wet sludge would slide right back in, mocking her efforts. Her hands blistered and bled. Her skin was a mosaic of mosquito bites and scratches from briars. One humid afternoon, exhausted and bordering on delirious, Harper threw her shovel down into the muck and sank to her knees. The water seeped through her patched waders. She looked at the murky water, the impenetrable reeds, and felt the crushing weight of her failure. Trent had been right. Gregory had been right. She was going to lose everything. In a fit of frustrated rage, she plunged her bare hands into the shallow water, intending to hurl a handful of the cursed mud at a nearby tree. But as she pulled her hands up, something caught her eye. The mud wasn't just dirt. Beneath the thin layer of stagnant water and rotting leaves, the soil was a rich, deep black. It was teeming with life. Tiny, translucent shrimp darted away from her fingers. The roots of the wild weeds were thick white and aggressively healthy. Harper paused, the tears drying on her dirty cheeks. She rubbed the mud between her thumb and forefinger. It was incredibly fine, almost like clay, but smelling earthy and potent, not dead. She remembered the agricultural journals she had obsessively read before signing the lease. Traditional farming fought the water. Traditional farming demanded dry land tractors and fertilizers. What if she stopped fighting the swamp? She looked around the 40 acres of submerged land with fresh eyes. She didn't need to drain the devil's spittoon. She needed to farm the water itself. The realization sent a jolt of electricity through her exhausted body. The swamp wasn't the obstacle. The swamp was the asset. But to exploit it, she was going to have to do something so radical, the entire county would think she had truly gone insane. Harper's pivot was born out of pure necessity, and midnight research conducted on a cracked smartphone hooked to a solar charger. If she couldn't grow terrestrial crops, she would grow aquatic ones. She zeroed in on high-value niche markets, wasabi, which required constant streams of nutrient-rich water, Japanese water celery, Wenanthe javanica, and a highly prized, fast-growing edible lotus used in luxury cosmetics and high-end Asian cuisine. But seeds and rootstock cost money she didn't have. Desperation led her to Amos Thatcher. Amos was a reclusive, 70-year-old retired botanist who ran a struggling native plant nursery on the outskirts of the county. He was notoriously grumpy with a beard that looked like a bird's nest and a deep distrust of corporate farming. Harper walked 5 miles to Amos's nursery, her boots still caked in the swamp's signature black mud. She found him in a greenhouse, aggressively pruning a row of magnolias. "I don't give handouts," Amos barked, before she even opened her mouth, eyeing her disheveled appearance. "I don't want a handout," Harper replied, standing tall. "I want a partnership. I leased the lower basin from Harrison Trent." Amos paused, his shears hovering mid-air. He let out a harsh bark of laughter. The devil's spittoon, Trent, finally found a sucker foolish enough to take it. "Girl, that land is a sinkhole. It'll swallow you whole." "It's not a sinkhole. It's a natural hydroponic basin," Harper countered, stepping closer. "The organic matter breakdown is off the charts. The pH is perfectly balanced for wetland agriculture. I just need seed stock, specifically water celery and lotus tubers. Give them to me on credit. When I harvest, you take 40% of the gross." Amos squinted at her, sizing up the fierce determination in her eyes. "Lotus tubers ain't cheap, and they take precision. You plant them too deep, they drown. Too shallow, the turtles eat them. You're out of your depth. I live in a tent in the middle of a swamp, Mr. Thatcher. I have literally nothing else to lose. I will guard those tubers with my life." Something in her raw honesty struck a chord with the old man. Amos muttered a string of curses, threw his shears onto a workbench, and walked toward a back shed. 30%, he grumbled over his shoulder. And you do the labor when I need heavy lifting around here." For the next 3 months, Harper worked like a woman possessed. She traded manual labor at Amos's nursery for the precious rootstock. Back at the swamp, she waded chest-deep into the murky water, meticulously planting hundreds of lotus tubers and seeding the shallows with water celery. She fashioned protective cages out of scavenged chicken wire to keep the snapping turtles away. She worked from dawn until the last sliver of moonlight vanished her body, aching her diet, consisting mostly of cheap instant ramen and whatever wild blackberries she could forage. Word of her bizarre farming methods inevitably reached Harrison Trent. At first, Trent was amused. He sat at the local diner sipping black coffee and regaling the town regulars with tales of the crazy city girl planting weeds in the mud. But his amusement turned to cold apprehension when he drove his luxury SUV down the county road, bordering the basin in late summer. Instead of a stagnant, dying swamp, the lower basin had transformed. The water celery had acted as a natural biofilter, clearing the murky water until it was glassy and clean. And rising above the surface were thousands of massive, vibrant green lotus leaves, dotted with breathtaking pink and white blossoms. It was an oasis. Trent was livid. He had intended to foreclose on Harper, take back the land, and eventually sell the water rights to a municipal developer once he proved the land was unfarmable. If Harper succeeded, her lease gave her the option to buy the 40 acres outright at a fixed, incredibly low price based on its initial, useless valuation. He stood to lose hundreds of thousands of dollars in potential real estate flips. Trent was not a man who liked to lose. A week later, the weather forecast predicted a massive unseasonal storm system moving off the Gulf. Beauregard County braced for heavy rains. Trent saw his opportunity. The county's primary flood control reservoir sat just 2 miles upstream from Harper's property. While the county managed the main spillway, Trent owned the land, where a secondary antiquated release gate sat, a gate designed to divert emergency overflow directly into the lower basin. Under the cover of darkness, as the first heavy sheets of rain began to fall, Trent sent 2 of his ranch hands to manually crank the rusted gears of the secondary gate wide open. Harper awoke in her tent to a terrifying roar. The ground beneath her was vibrating. She unzipped the flap and shined her heavy-duty flashlight out into the darkness. A wall of churning, frothing brown water was tearing through the trees, heading straight for her carefully cultivated fields. The water level was rising inches by the minute. "No, no, no!" She screamed into the howling wind, scrambling out of the tent as the water rushed over her ankles, then her knees. She waded desperately toward the lotus beds, but the current was too strong. The floodwaters ripped through her chicken wire defenses. She watched in horror as the surging torrent uprooted her water celery, sending months of agonizing labor swirling away into the darkness. The flood swallowed the lotus blossoms, dragging them under the muddy violence of the artificially induced flash flood. Harper clung to the trunk of a massive cypress tree, weeping uncontrollably as the freezing rain lashed against her face. Everything was gone. Trent had finally won. The swamp had claimed its final victory. She stayed shivering in the tree until dawn broke, illuminating a landscape of absolute devastation. The water had receded slightly, leaving behind a thick, suffocating layer of brown silt over everything. But as the morning sun hit the water, Harper noticed something entirely unexpected. The flood hadn't just brought destruction. It had brought thousands of pounds of rich upstream topsoil, depositing a perfect layer of nutrient-dense silt across the entire basin. And while the delicate blossoms of the lotus had been destroyed, the heavy, valuable tubers had not been washed away. In fact, the violent current had naturally separated and spread the tubers across the entire 40 acres, doing in one night what would have taken Harper 5 years of back-breaking manual labor to accomplish. She wasn't ruined. Trent's Sabotage had just accidentally scaled her operation tenfold. The morning after the flood, the lower basin was an eerie landscape of flattened reeds and thick brown silt. Harper Montgomery stood knee-deep in the cold sludge, shivering, but entirely fixated on the miracle buried beneath her boots. Trent's Sabotage, intended to drown her dreams, had instead acted as a massive, violent tiller. The flash flood had churned the swamp floor, aerated the anaerobic layers of muck, and spread the lotus tubers which she had meticulously planted in a confined quarter-acre across the entirety of the 40-acre property. She waded back to the shore, her mind racing. The sheer volume of topsoil deposited by the floodwaters was a biological gold mine, packed with nitrogen and phosphorus from the upstream cattle pastures. But she needed expert confirmation. 2 hours later, Amos Thatcher's rusted Chevrolet truck rattled to a halt at the edge of the access road. The grumpy botanist stepped out, taking in the devastation with a heavy sigh. "I told you, girl," Amos grumbled, pulling his frayed canvas hat down over his eyes. "The swamp takes what it wants. Looks like a washout. I'll write off the tubers. You pack up your tent and go back to the city before you catch pneumonia." "Amos, put your waders on," Harper said, her voice eerily calm. She tossed a spare pair of rubber boots at his feet. "I need you to look at the soil profile." Amos scowled, but complied, trudging behind her into the muck. When they reached the center of the basin, Harper knelt, plunging her arms up to the elbows into the cold mud, and hauled up a massive, pristine lotus tuber. It was thicker than her forearm firm and aggressively healthy. Amos gasped, dropping to his knees beside her, uncaring of the mud seeping through his jeans. He ran a calloused thumb over the pale skin of the tuber. The flood. It didn't rot them. It buried them deeper under fresh silt. "My God, Harper. The nutrient density here right now is staggering. If these take root in this new soil bed—" "They won't just take root," Harper interrupted, her eyes flashing with a fierce, dangerous light. "They're going to explode. The entire 40 acres is seeded now. But we have a problem. I found fresh tire tracks and boot prints up by the secondary spillway gate on county land. The lock was cut with bolt cutters." Amos slowly looked up, the realization dawning on his weathered face. Harrison Trent, that son of a bitch, opened the emergency release. "He tried to drown me," Harper said softly, looking out over the water. "He knows that if I make this farm profitable, my lease gives me the right to buy the basin at its unimproved valuation, which is practically pennies. He wants to break me before harvest." "You going to the sheriff?" Amos asked. "With what proof? A set of muddy tire tracks. Trent owns half the deputies in this county." "No," Harper said, her jaw setting into a hard line. "I'm not going to fight him in court. I'm going to humiliate him in the bank." Over the next 4 months, the Devil's Spittoon underwent a terrifyingly beautiful metamorphosis. Fueled by the nutrient-dense flood silt and the relentless summer sun, the lotus plants grew with supernatural speed. By late August, the 40 acres were an impenetrable forest of massive emerald green leaves and thousands of giant fragrant blossoms. Beneath the surface, the water celery had returned with a vengeance, acting as a living filtration system that kept the water crystal clear and perfectly pH balanced. But growing the crop was only half the battle. Selling it was the true war. Harper knew local farmers' markets wouldn't cut it. She needed high-end volume buyers who understood the value of organic, wild, simulated wetland agriculture. She spent her nights huddled in her tent, emailing chefs, cosmetic companies, and specialty distributors. Her breakthrough came in the form of Preston Caldwell, an aggressive, forward-thinking executive chef from a 3-Michelin-star restaurant in Chicago. Caldwell built his reputation on hyper-sourced, hyper-organic ingredients. After receiving a vacuum-sealed sample of Harper's water celery and a single pristine lotus root via overnight mail, Caldwell booked a flight to Beauregard County. When Caldwell arrived in his designer loafers, he looked completely out of place, standing on the edge of the swamp. But Harper didn't offer apologies for the mud. She handed him a knife and a freshly pulled root. Caldwell sliced a piece, wiped it clean with bottled water, and bit into it. His eyes widened. The texture was perfectly crisp. The flavor was earthy sweet and complex, untainted by chemical fertilizers. "I've imported these from Kyoto for $50 a pound," Caldwell whispered, staring at the endless sea of green. "And they don't taste half this good. How much can you supply?" 4 tons by October," Harper replied without missing a beat. Caldwell looked at her, noting her mud-stained clothes and the fierce, unyielding posture. "I'll take exclusive rights to your culinary grade, $20 a pound wholesale. I'll wire a 20% advance tomorrow." Harper shook his hand, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was a massive contract, but it wasn't enough to secure the land. She needed more capital to execute the buyout clause before her lease expired on November 1st. Word of the Caldwell deal leaked through the county grapevine, eventually reaching Harrison Trent. Furious that his sabotage had failed, Trent decided to stop playing games. He sent Harper a formal notarized letter claiming she had violated a microscopic buried clause in the lease regarding unauthorized water diversion, a completely fabricated charge based on her natural biofiltration setup. Trent demanded immediate eviction by October 31st, giving her just weeks to harvest 40 acres of submerged crops before he legally bulldozed the land. The clock was ticking, and the swamp was about to become a battleground. Harvesting 40 acres of submerged, deeply buried root vegetables without heavy machinery was considered impossible. The local agricultural community laughed at the prospect. You couldn't drive a tractor into the devil's spittoon. It would sink to the axles in seconds. But Harper Montgomery had stopped caring about what was considered possible months ago. Armed with Caldwell's advance, Harper didn't buy machinery. She bought manpower. She went to the local hardware store and purchased every sheet of high-density polyethylene plastic they had, fashioning them into custom flat-bottomed mud sleds that could glide over the swamp's surface without sinking. Then she went to the local dive bar, where Trent's underpaid seasonal ranch hands drank. Standing on a pool table to command the room, Harper offered triple the hourly wage Trent paid in cash at the end of every day, to anyone willing to wade into the mud. Amos Thatcher brought his 3 burly nephews. Within 48 hours, Harper had assembled a ragtag army of 30 men and women, all clad in waders, ready to pull a miracle out of the muck. The harvest was brutal, grueling work. The October air was turning frigid, and the water bit at their skin. They waded chest deep, plunging their hands into the freezing mud to carefully extract the massive lotus tubers without snapping them. The sleds were loaded with thousands of pounds of produce and hauled back to the shoreline by sheer human muscle. For 3 weeks, they worked from sunrise until headlights and portable floodlights were required to see. Harper was right there with them, her face smeared with silt-hauling sleds until her shoulders bled beneath her jacket. As the culinary-grade roots were shipped off in refrigerated trucks to Caldwell in Chicago, Harper executed her second masterstroke. The bruised, broken, and oversized tubers, the ugly crop that restaurants wouldn't buy, were not discarded. She had secured a secondary contract with an elite California-based botanical skincare company that used lotus extract for its high-end anti-aging serums. They didn't care what the roots looked like. They only cared about the pure organic chemical composition. They bought the remaining 15 tons of biomass for a staggering sum. By October 28th, 3 days before Trent's eviction deadline and the expiration of her lease, the lower basin was stripped bare. The harvest was complete. On the morning of October 30th, Harrison Trent sat in his mahogany-paneled office, reviewing the eviction paperwork. He smiled, savoring the victory. He had driven out to the basin the day before and seen that Harper had packed up her tent. The land was empty. She had finally broken. He reached for his phone to call the county sheriff to finalize the trespass notices. The heavy oak door to his office suddenly swung open. Harper Montgomery walked in. She was no longer covered in mud. She wore a sharp, tailored suit, her hair pulled back immaculately. She looked like the formidable corporate strategist she had been before the world had chewed her up. Trent's smile faltered. "Miss Montgomery, you're trespassing. The eviction. The eviction is invalid, Harrison." Harper interrupted, stepping up to his desk. She didn't sit. She stood tall, radiating an icy authority. "You cited a lease violation regarding water diversion. My lawyers at the State Agricultural Board reviewed it. Since I utilized native in situ biofiltration, no water was mechanically diverted. Your claim is baseless." Trent sneered. "It doesn't matter. Your lease expires tomorrow at midnight. The deposit is non-refundable and the land reverts to me. Get out of my office." "I think you need to reread Section 4, Paragraph B of our contract," Harper said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. She pulled a thick leather folder from her briefcase and dropped it onto his pristine desk. "The lessee retains the absolute right to purchase the leased property outright at the initial unimproved valuation of $1,000 per acre, provided the purchase is executed prior to the lease expiration." Trent's face went pale. "You don't have $40,000. You're living in a nylon tent." Harper opened the folder. Inside was a signed purchase agreement, and clipped to the top was a certified cashier's check made out to Harrison Trent for exactly $40,000. "I don't live in a tent anymore," Harper said, leaning in so close Trent could see his own terrified reflection in her eyes. "My culinary contracts just grossed $400,000. My cosmetic biomass contracts grossed another $600,000. I am purchasing the lower basin, Mr. Trent. And if you ever set foot on my property or touch that spillway gate again, I will bury you so deep in federal environmental lawsuits you won't see daylight for a decade." Trent stared at the cashier's check, his hands trembling with a mixture of rage and absolute defeat. He had handed her a useless swamp, and she had turned it into a gold mine. Within 2 years, Montgomery Aquatic Farms became the premier supplier of organic wetland botanicals in North America. Harper built a state-of-the-art, eco-friendly processing facility right on the edge of the basin, employing the very locals who had helped her pull her first harvest from the freezing mud. She never drained the swamp. Instead, she let it thrive, proving that sometimes the greatest value isn't found in fighting nature, but in surrendering to it. She had started with 43 cents and a sinkhole. Today, she stood on the observation deck of her 7-figure agricultural empire, looking out over the glassy water, knowing that the deepest roots always grow in the darkest mud. Harper's journey from a maxed-out credit card to a $1 million agricultural empire proves that true innovation often looks like absolute insanity to the rest of the world. She didn't conquer nature. She collaborated with it. If this story of resilience, grit, and swamp mud revenge inspired you, please hit that like button. Share this incredible journey with someone who needs a reminder to never give up, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories of unstoppable underdogs.